Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are looking at a morning ritual that is just about as global as it gets. That first cup of coffee, usually before a single bite of food. Statistics suggest something like 9 out of 10 coffee drinkers do this. For most of us, it's just the switch that turns the day on. But, we have to ask a tougher question. Does this habit just wake us up, or is it launching a kind of chemical assault on our stomach lining that leads to real long-term damage? We're looking at some conflicting data today, from nursing journals in Indonesia all the way to gastroenterology reviews from the Cleveland Clinic. I'm going to be arguing that introducing coffee to an empty stomach is, well, it's a physiological mistake that wears down that stomach lining over time.
And I'm coming at this from, a very different angle. I'm here to argue that this whole damage narrative is largely a myth. It often confuses, temporary discomfort with actual pathology. The human stomach is an evolutionary marvel. It's designed to handle extreme acid. And while coffee is absolutely a stimulant, the evidence suggests that real tissue destruction, I'm talking about things like ulcers, has almost nothing to do with your morning Americano and everything to do with bacteria and other factors.
Okay, so let's start with the case for damage. When we look at the literature, and I'm talking specifically about some of these reviews from the Journal of Applied Nursing and Health, we aren't just talking about a bit of indigestion. We're talking about a very specific mechanism where coffee acts as an aggressive chemical agent. When you drink it on an empty stomach, you're introducing a potent stimulant for hydrochloric acid, or HCl, into a vacuum.
A vacuum?
Exactly. There's no food in there to act as a buffer. Normally when you eat, your stomach makes acid to digest that food. The food soaks it up, the system works. But here, caffeine stimulates that same hypersecretion of acid with nothing for it to do. And this acid, it doesn't just sit there, it attacks the gastric mucosa, the stomach wall itself. The data suggests continuous exposure leads to inflammation, which is characterized by something called fibrin tissue.
Could you just clarify what fibrin tissue is for us?
Yeah, absolutely. You can think of fibrin as a kind of biological spackle. It's a protein that's involved in blood clotting, but in this context, it's essentially scar tissue filling in where healthy cells used to be. If you find fibrin, it means there's been an injury. And over time, this cycle can lead to atrophy, a thinning of that mucosal layer. This is a causal link to gastritis, which is inflammation of the stomach lining. It's not just a correlation.
Okay. I see the mechanism you're laying out, and on paper, it does sound pretty frightening. However, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it seems to confuse acid secretion with acid injury. We have to look at the PMC narrative reviews and data from places like the Cleveland Clinic, which are very clear on this. The stomach is naturally an extremely acidic environment. We're talking a pH of 1 to 2 often.
Which is incredibly acidic, yeah.
It's battery acid level. But the stomach is built for it. It has this thick mucus layer specifically for this purpose. The idea that coffee, which has a pH of around 5, by the way, similar to a banana, is what tips the balance into destruction, it just seems overstated. My core thesis here is resilience. The evidence shows that coffee does not cause peptic ulcers. That is a myth that just won't die. Ulcers are almost always caused by Helicobacter pylori bacteria or, the overuse of NSAIDs like ibuprofen. If coffee was the corrosive agent you're suggesting, given the billions of cups drunk every day, we would see a global epidemic of stomach holes. We just don't. In fact, coffee consumption is linked to reduced risks of liver disease and gallstones, which suggests the net effect on the digestive system is actually beneficial.
I see why you're leaning on the ulcer myth defense. But let me offer a different perspective. You're right, H. pylori is the main driver of ulcers, but we can't ignore the environment where that bacteria can thrive. A study from the 1OIU Community Health Center found a significant statistical association, meaning a p-value of 0.000, which is, incredibly significant, between coffee habits and the incidence of gastritis.
A p-value of 0 is a bold claim.
While it implies a near certain statistical link, at least in that group, the issue isn't always a full-blown ulcer right away. It's the chronic, slow erosion of the lining. You say the stomach is resilient, but the Indonesian data points out that frequency, and they define that as more than 3 glasses a day. Without that food buffer, it accelerates the formation of that fibrin tissue I mentioned,
It triggers a cycle of inflammation. And look, it's not just the acid, it's the cortisol. Drinking coffee between 8 and 9 a.m., right when cortisol is naturally peaking, it just amplifies the body's stress response. You are chemically stressing a system that's already vulnerable because it hasn't been fed.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame the cortisol thing a bit differently. We can get into that stress response in a minute, but I want to stick with this physical damage idea. You cite the 1OUE data, which, okay, is compelling, but we have to look at definitions. Often what gets labeled as damage in these observational studies is really just functional dyspepsia, indigestion. The PMC review itself notes that these studies are controversial, and the link often disappears when you control for other factors. And this empty stomach danger, it confuses symptoms with pathology. Yes, you might get heartburn, which is the valve at the top of your stomach relaxing, but that is not the same thing as the coffee itself eating away your stomach lining.
Okay, well, let's dig into that physiology of the mucosal damage then. You seem to be dismissing the fibrin tissue finding, but the Journal of Applied Nursing and Health is very specific. This inflammation happens continuously if the stomach is exposed to irritants like coffee without a buffer. The inflamed tissue fills with fibrin, leading to a loss of the gastric mucosal layer. That is atrophy. It's the thinning of the stomach's own defense system.
But is the coffee the sole culprit there?
It is the trigger. Look, when you say the stomach is designed for acid, that's true, but it's designed to produce acid in response to food. That's the biological contract, right? When you trigger that gastrin release, the hormone that tells the stomach to get ready, and that HCl spike happens with nothing to digest, that acid diffuses right into the mucosa. It's a direct chemical irritation. You are essentially tricking your body into digesting itself.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the coffee itself is the primary aggressor, specifically because of the chemical complexity of the bean. We have to bring in the idea of roasting here, which the literature says is a huge variable.
You think the roast level changes the pH?
It changes the chemistry. Studies have shown that dark roasts contain a compound called N-methylpyridinium. Now, this isn't in the raw bean, it's created during roasting, and this compound actually reduces gastric acid secretion. So a dark roast espresso might actually be gentler on your stomach than a light roast drip. The PMC data suggests that while coffee does stimulate gastrin, the jump to mucosal atrophy is a leap that usually requires other problems. If you look at the Cleveland Clinic stance, they say that for most people, the digestive system is efficient enough to handle this. The damage you're citing is likely in populations with other risk factors. Poor diet, smoking, and existing H. pylori infection, which the coffee might make worse, but it doesn't cause it on its own.
I think you're being a little too charitable to the bean. Even if we say that dark roasts are slightly less acidic, we're still dealing with a broad behavior. The Continental Hospital's review highlights that coffee, especially black coffee, has acidic compounds that directly irritate the stomach lining. And what about erosive esophagitis? It's not just the stomach. If we concede that coffee relaxes the lower esophageal sphincter, which I think you have to, then for the, 25% of people with symptomatic GERD, the Taiwanese study mentioned this, drinking it on an empty stomach makes that mucosal injury much worse. You can't separate the valve from the damage.
Okay, I'll concede the valve issue, but that is a mechanical problem, not a stomach damage issue. The coffee relaxes the LES, which allows reflux. That's heartburn. It's unpleasant, sure, but it is not the coffee burning a hole in your stomach. And actually, on the topic of motility, coffee stimulates cholecystokinin and colon motility. I mean, it creates the urge to poop within 4 to 30 minutes for a lot of people.
And you see that as a positive?
Absolutely. That is a sign of a healthy, active digestive tract, not a damaged one. It stimulates peristalsis. The PMC data shows that obesity is a much, much stronger predictor of GERD than coffee intake. If an obese person drinks coffee, blaming the coffee for their reflux is missing the forest for the trees. I mean, tea and carbonated drinks do the same thing to the valve, but they don't get demonized in the same way.
I'm just not convinced because you're isolating the coffee from the key context here, the empty stomach. The prompt for our debate is specifically about that factor. When you have food in there, you have a buffer. But rapid absorption happens when the stomach is empty. And that leads us to the systemic issue, cortisol. We're not just talking about digestion now. We are talking about stress hormones.
Right, the cortisol spike.
The argument that coffee makes us stressed.
Well, it's not just a feeling. It's a measurable hormonal event. Your cortisol naturally peaks between 8 and 9 in the morning. It's the cortisol awakening response. It's the body's natural alarm clock. When you hit that peak with a strong dose of caffeine on an empty stomach, you are just amplifying that stress response. Dr. Oracle notes this can lead to jitters, anxiety, and even insulin resistance. You get that blood sugar crash because you haven't eaten, and your body pumps out cortisol to compensate. That metabolic disruption is a form of physiological damage.
That is a compelling argument. But what about tolerance? I mean, the Plantamedica and Cow Our World sources are very clear on this. Yes, there's a cortisol response in people who rarely drink coffee, but it's temporary, and it's significantly reduced in habitual drinkers. If you drink coffee every morning, your body adjusts. That stress is a short-term reaction, not long-term damage. It's a blip, and to call a temporary cortisol bump damage is frankly a bit of a stretch. For a healthy person, the body regulates that spike pretty easily.
But we aren't just talking about perfectly healthy bodies in a lab. We're talking about the general population. The Continental Hospital's review points out that this cortisol spike can impact metabolism and even lead to weight gain over time. And this tolerance argument, look, just because the body stops screaming doesn't mean it isn't being harmed. The Journal of Applied Nursing and Health connects the dots between the stress, the acid, and a breakdown of immunity. The production of cortisol during stress can cause a decrease in lymphocytes, your white blood cells. So, by spiking your cortisol artificially, you could be reducing your body's ability to fight infection.
So you're suggesting the coffee lowers immunity enough to let bacteria like H. pylori take hold?
Precisely. It brings us right back to H. pylori. You're creating a perfect environment for the very bacteria you blame for ulcers to thrive. You suppress the immune response with cortisol, and you erode the mucosal barrier with acid. It's a perfect storm.
See, I come with the immune system from the other direction. We know coffee is packed with antioxidants. It's the #1 source in the Western diet. The PMC review explicitly says it has a powerful protective effect against liver cancer. It reduces the risk of gallstones. If coffee were suppressing the immune system to a dangerous degree, we just wouldn't see these major protective effects. I think we have to go back to the diet and lifestyle covariates from the Wonoyu study. You mentioned that p-value, but was it really the coffee?
The study controlled for factors, and the correlation was stark. The combination of skipping breakfast, the empty stomach, and coffee was the specific risk factor they identified.
Okay, but let's really look at who skips breakfast and drinks 3 cups of coffee. I mean, these are often people with high-stress jobs, poor sleep, they might be smokers, or they're using NSAIDs for stress headaches. The PMC review itself says that smoking and NSAIDs are major confounders that often get ignored in these coffee causes gastritis narratives. Are we really blaming the coffee for the damage caused by the ibuprofen taken right alongside it? The acidity of coffee is pH 5. That is less acidic than your own stomach acid. I just don't buy that it's destroying a lining designed for pH 1, unless other factors are already destroying the defenses.
I see why you want to shift the blame to lifestyle, but the biological mechanism is still there. Even if coffee is pH 5, it stimulates the secretion of more pH 1 acid. That's the key. And regarding that Wonoyu study, the sheer strength of that p-value means we can't just wave it away. The Journal of Applied Nursing and Health describes the process. Caffeine stimulates HCl. Without food, that acid goes against the wall. That fibrin tissue finding, for me, that's the smoking gun. That is evidence of injury and repair. If you're doing that every single day, you have chronic inflammation. That is the literal definition of gastritis.
But does that finding universal, or is it specific to a population that maybe has a high prevalence of H. pylori to begin with? I mean, in the Cleveland Clinic review, they don't mention fibrous tissue as a common outcome. They talk about jitters, the urge to poop, heartburn, but they explicitly say coffee doesn't appear to play a role in ulcer formation. If the mechanism you describe was a dominant force, ulcers would be basically inevitable for daily drinkers, and they're not. This suggests the stomach's mucus barrier is perfectly capable of handling that morning acid spike, provided the person is otherwise healthy.
Provided the person is otherwise healthy is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Continental Hospitals warns that if you're dehydrated, and let's be honest, most people wake up dehydrated, the effect is worse. You're drinking a diuretic on an empty, dehydrated stomach. It just concentrates those acidic compounds. You mentioned the liver benefits, and I'll grant you those, but we're talking about the stomach. You can have a healthy liver and a totally ravaged stomach lining. The data from Indonesia suggests that for a significant chunk of the population, especially those drinking more than 3 glasses a day, the risk is not theoretical, it's clinical.
I will concede that volume matters, that more than 3 glasses metric is significant. The dose makes the poison, right? But for the average person having 1 or 2 cups, the consensus from places like the Cleveland Clinic is that the damage narrative causes unnecessary fear. They suggest that if you feel pain, you should stop. But if you don't, you aren't silently eroding your stomach. The body signals damage with pain. This silent killer idea for coffee just doesn't track with what most gastroenterologists say.
I'd argue that listening to your body is sometimes too late. Inflammation can be low-grade for a long time before it becomes acute pain. The Journal of Applied Nursing and Health talks about atrophy. That's a slow thinning. By the time you have recurrent gastritis, the damage is already done. Why even take the risk? The solution is so simple. Eat a small snack, a piece of toast, buffer the cortisol, buffer the acid.
That is a fair mitigation strategy, I agree, but I maintain that for the vast majority, the risk is minimal. We shouldn't pathologize a morning ritual that brings so much cognitive benefit, and yes, even liver protection. The stomach is tougher than you're giving it credit for.
And I maintain that the stomach is tough, but it's not invincible. We are exposing it to a concentrated chemical stressor at its most vulnerable moment of the day. So as we wrap up, it's pretty clear this is a battle between a physiological theory on one hand and clinical reality on the other. From my side, the evidence from these nursing and health studies is a serious warning bell. We have a clear mechanism. Caffeine triggers acid, no food means no buffer, and the result is mucosal irritation, fibrin formation, and gastritis. It's an unnecessary physiological stressor on the stomach lining, not to mention the metabolic chaos from that cortisol spike.
And from my side, I stand by the resilience of the human digestive system. The major gastroenterological reviews suggest that for a healthy person, this damage is largely a myth. The stomach is an acid bath by design. The discomfort people feel is likely functional, reflux or jitters, not actual pathological destruction like ulcers. And the long-term benefits to the liver and gallbladder suggest that coffee is, on net, a friend to our digestive tract, not an enemy.
I think we can both agree, though, on one piece of advice that comes from all the sources. Listening to your body is actually science-based. If you feel pain, if you have a history of stomach issues, then yes, this empty stomach habit is likely hurting you.
Absolutely. If it hurts, eat a croissant first. But if you feel fine, don't let the fear of fibrin ruin your morning espresso. It might also be worth checking the roast of your beans. Maybe that dark roast really is the stomach-friendly option after all.
The relationship between coffee and the stomach is evidently not just about the bean, but about the biology of the drinker. Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Until next time.